It started with a sandwich. On a cold afternoon in Florence, inside a crowded little bakery, where the smell of fresh bread clung to every corner, a young girl noticed a boy who didn't belong. His blonde hair was messy, his face pale, and his blue eyes never left the display case. He wasn't staring at people, only at food. The other customers brushed past him, but he stood frozen silent, as though hunger had anchored him to the spot. And then something happened that no one expected. 7-year-old Emily reached into her paper bag, pulled out her half-eaten ham and cheese sandwich, and held it out. "Here," she said softly, "you can have mine." Have you ever witnessed a moment so small, yet so powerful it changed everything? Leave your thoughts below, because this story proves that kindness doesn't just echo, it thunders. And before we're done, you'll see how one child's sandwich reached places money never could. Stay with me, because what comes next is shocking. Emily was traveling with her grandmother, Margaret, an American retired teacher who believed in seeing the world through stories and streets rather than postcards. That day, while Margaret was choosing pastries, Emily noticed the boy. He looked about her age, maybe a little older, but something about him seemed fragile, as if life had pressed too heavily on his shoulders. His jacket was too thin for the winter chill, and his hands trembled against the glass. The bakery was warm, filled with laughter and chatter, but the boy stood apart, invisible in plain sight. He never asked for help. He didn't beg. He only stared, and something about that silence pulled Emily closer. Most children would have clung to their food. Most adults would have looked away. But Emily had been raised on her grandmother's belief that when you see someone hungry, you don't wait for permission, you act. The boy hesitated at first, his lips parting, as if words wanted to escape but couldn't. Then, with a careful, almost reverent motion, he accepted the sandwich. He didn't speak, but the way he held it, both hands cradling the bread, like it was something sacred, said enough. Emily watched him take the first bite, and for a flicker of a second she thought she saw tears in his eyes. Margaret noticed too. She stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "You did the right thing," she whispered. The old woman's voice carried warmth, but inside she felt a prick of worry. Why was this child alone? Why hadn't anyone claimed him? Outside, the streets of Florence bustled with tourists snapping photos of cathedrals and shopkeepers sweeping their steps. Inside that bakery, though, time seemed to stall. The boy finished half the sandwich quickly, as though afraid it might vanish, but he saved the other half, tucking it carefully into his jacket pocket. That single action unsettled Margaret. It was the move of someone who wasn't sure when the next meal would come. Emily leaned closer. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice as light as the snowfall outside. For a long moment there was no answer. Then, barely audible, came a single word. "William?" The sound of his own name seemed to surprise him as much as it did them. He hadn't spoken it in days, maybe weeks. Margaret exchanged a look with her granddaughter. This boy needed help, but it wasn't the kind you solved with coins tossed into a cup. At that very moment, something stirred in the bakery. A man by the window had been watching. He quietly slipped outside, phone pressed to his ear. Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. Not loud and chaotic, but steady, deliberate. Police cars rolled to a stop by the curb lights flashing against the bakery windows. Customers froze bread baskets in hand. Emily tightened her grip on William's arm, protective despite her size. "Don't be afraid," she whispered, but William's body went rigid, as if flight was his only language. When the officers entered, everything shifted. They weren't looking for trouble. They were looking for him. In rushed voices, they confirmed the boy's identity. William Whitmore, the missing son of billionaire Richard Whitmore, had just been found standing beside a girl who had offered him her sandwich. Gasps spread through the bakery. Margaret held Emily close, torn between relief and confusion. She had thought this was a hungry stranger, but no. This was the child whose face had been splashed across international headlines for weeks. And Emily, without knowing, had done what no search party, no detective, no technology had managed. She reached him not with money, not with authority, but with food and kindness. The bakery, once filled with casual conversation, now buzzed with stunned disbelief. People whispered, phones came out, photos snapped. Margaret tried to shield Emily from the attention, but the story had already begun to grow legs. By the time they stepped outside, the street was swarming with cameras. Emily didn't care about any of that. She only cared that William was no longer staring at food from the outside, but walking beside her, holding her hand. She couldn't know yet that this moment would ripple far beyond Florence, beyond Italy, beyond anything her young mind could imagine. She couldn't know that within days, dozens of gleaming supercars would line up outside her grandmother's modest home, their engines rumbling like thunder sent by a father whose gratitude could not be measured in dollars. But it all began here with a sandwich, a child's courage, and a boy who finally remembered his own name. What would you have done if you were Emily? Would you have offered your food to a stranger? Share your answer in the comments, because the smallest choices we make can sometimes change the course of someone else's life. And in this story, that choice was only the beginning. At the police station, the world around Emily felt like it had sped up. Reporters, flashing cameras, hurried voices. Everyone seemed to be moving with purpose except the boy beside her. William sat in a chair, too big for his small frame, his hands tucked under his sleeves, eyes fixed on the floor. The officers spoke in careful tones, explaining to Margaret that the boy was indeed William Whitmore, the missing son of one of the wealthiest men in Europe. But all Emily saw was a boy who looked like he might disappear again if someone stopped paying attention. When the heavy doors swung open, a tall man rushed inside. His expensive coat trailed behind him, his hair was slightly unkempt, and his face was etched with weeks of worry. Richard Whitmore had the kind of presence that filled the room, but in that moment he was only a father. He fell to his knees in front of his son, his voice breaking as he whispered, "William, my boy." The room held its breath. For weeks, William had refused to speak, refusing even the simplest words. But now, with Emily's small hand still resting lightly on his shoulder, the silence cracked. It came out barely audible, but enough to shatter the tension. "Daddy." It was a single word, but it rolled through the station like thunder. Officers exchanged glances. Margaret closed her eyes, and Richard pulled his son into his arms with the desperation of a man who had lived every parent's nightmare. Emily watched her chest tightening. She didn't fully understand the weight of the moment, but she knew it mattered. Richard thanked the officers, his voice thick, but his attention never left his son. He noticed Emily, then standing beside Margaret, clutching the strap of her little satchel. He rose and approached her, his eyes glistening. "You stayed with him," he said quietly. "You gave him what he needed most." Emily didn't know how to answer. She simply nodded, unsure why a billionaire was thanking her for something that had felt so natural. Within hours, arrangements were made. Richard insisted on bringing Emily and Margaret to his estate on Lake Como as a gesture of gratitude. Margaret resisted, at first uneasy about stepping into the world of wealth and privilege, but Emily's grip on her hand was firm. She wanted to see William again. The journey to the Whitmore estate felt like stepping into another world. The car carried them through winding roads, past rolling hills and villages, until the gates appeared tall iron and grand enough to mark the boundary between ordinary life and a realm reserved for the untouchable few. Beyond the gates, manicured gardens stretched endlessly, and the house rose like something out of a storybook, its windows glowing in the twilight. Inside the opulence was overwhelming chandeliers glittered above polished marble floors, and every corner seemed to hold a piece of art older than Emily's entire family history. Yet, for all the wealth, there was something hollow about the place. The grand estate, despite its beauty, had the quiet of a museum lonely echoing. It wasn't a home. William led Emily to his room, a space filled with expensive toys, untouched and pristine. The shelves were lined with books no child had ever read, and a train set stretched across the floor like an abandoned amusement park. Emily noticed a stuffed rabbit with one ear slightly torn lying on the bed. She picked it up gently. "What's his name?" she asked. William's lips moved, the faintest of smiles appearing as he whispered Mr. Floppy. It was the second word he had spoken since returning. Emily held the toy out to him, and he hugged it tightly. Margaret, standing in the doorway, felt her throat catch. She understood then why her granddaughter had been brought here. It wasn't about a sandwich anymore. It was about helping a boy find pieces of himself again. Richard watched from the hall, torn between gratitude and guilt. He had built an empire, collected treasures, and commanded respect in boardrooms across the globe. But he hadn't been able to give his son the one thing he needed most: safety. Seeing his boy soften in Emily's presence planted something in him, a thought he couldn't shake. Perhaps what the world needed wasn't more power or wealth, but more simple acts of staying. In the days that followed, Emily and William became inseparable. They built forts from blankets in the middle of a palace that had never known play. They sipped cocoa in the library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes that suddenly felt less intimidating with children's laughter echoing through the shelves. William, once silent, began humming to himself, sometimes even giggling when Emily told her clumsy jokes. At night, Margaret sat with Richard in the vast dining room. They spoke of childhood, of loss, of the strange way life circles back on itself. Richard confessed he had nearly given up hope, that he had prepared himself for the worst. Margaret reminded him that children often need presence more than perfection. One evening, as the sun melted into the lake, Richard stood before a window, his son asleep upstairs. Emily's laughter drifted down the hall. He turned to Margaret, his voice low but determined. "I can't just repay kindness with gifts or money. That's not enough. What your granddaughter gave my son, it can't be measured. It needs to be multiplied." Margaret raised her brow, curious. Richard continued. "I want to build something lasting, not for appearances, for children who need it. A foundation in Emily's name." Margaret hesitated. She had lived long enough to know that wealth often came with strings, but she also saw the sincerity in his eyes. She thought of the boy who had finally said his father's name, the little girl who had given away her sandwich without hesitation, and the possibility that something larger might be born from it all. Meanwhile, upstairs, Emily sat beside William's bed. Mr. Floppy nestled between them. She whispered stories her grandmother had told her, tales about courage, kindness, and the idea that sometimes the smallest things mattered most. William didn't speak, but his breathing steadied, and his hand clutched hers until he drifted into sleep. The boy, with silent eyes, was slowly finding his voice again, not because of therapists or treatments, but because someone his own age had seen him when the world had looked away. In Emily's presence, he wasn't a missing child or a billionaire's heir. He was simply William, and in the quiet of that estate, something remarkable was beginning to take shape, something that would soon grow larger than either of them could imagine. The world saw wealth and headlines. But Margaret, Emily, and Richard saw something else, the possibility of turning a single sandwich into a spark that might light up countless lives. And in William's silent eyes, a glimmer was returning, one that suggested he too believed it could be true. The first time Margaret heard the roar, she thought it was thunder. The sound rumbled through the quiet street of her modest neighborhood in Boston, shaking the windows and drawing curious faces to every doorstep. But when she stepped onto the porch with Emily beside her, it wasn't thunder at all. One after another, polished machines of impossible beauty turned the corner, sleek Ferraris, gleaming Lamborghinis, Rolls-Royces, with chrome grills that caught the morning sun. It was as if the entire world of wealth had been let loose on her simple block. Dozens of the Billionaire's supercars had come engines, purring paint jobs, glistening, each one bearing the unmistakable crest of the Whitmore family. Neighbors poured out of their homes, whispering in disbelief. Children ran barefoot down the sidewalks, pointing and cheering. Someone shouted, "It's like a movie." Emily's small hand slipped into Margaret's as her eyes widened. She had never seen anything like it, not even in the glossy magazines her grandmother kept hidden in the attic. And then the lead car stopped right in front of their gate. The door swung open and Richard Whitmore stepped out, flanked not by bodyguards, but by William, who clutched Mr. Floppy to his chest. Richard's eyes scanned the modest white house with its peeling paint and flower boxes Margaret had tended herself. He smiled, not the polished grin of a man used to cameras, but the raw, grateful smile of a father who had found something he thought was lost forever. "Emily," he called, his voice carrying over the crowd. "My son wanted to see you." Emily didn't hesitate. She ran down the steps, her braids bouncing, and William met her halfway, his steps faster than anyone had seen since his return. The two children embraced, and for a moment the entire spectacle of wealth, the supercars, the murmuring crowd, the photographers who had already begun to gather, faded into the background. What mattered was a boy holding his friend's hand, and a girl who had never treated him as anything more or less than himself. Richard joined them, his expression solemn. "You gave my son back to me," he said to Margaret, "and I will never forget it. I wanted the world to know that gratitude doesn't always come in quiet whispers." His gesture was loud, extravagant, impossible to miss, yet it wasn't about the cars. It was about honoring a truth that in a city filled with strangers, a child's compassion had succeeded where power had failed. The media swarmed, drawn like moths to flame. Cameras clicked, reporters called out questions, but Richard waved them aside. Instead, he invited Emily and Margaret into the lead car. "Come," he said, "I want to show you something." The ride was unlike anything Emily had ever known. Leather seats cradled her as the convoy moved in unison, a caravan of opulence cutting through Boston streets usually filled with commuters and delivery trucks. People stopped on corners, phones raised, capturing the sight. Yet inside the car it felt oddly quiet. Richard leaned forward. "I've made a decision," he said, glancing at Margaret with steady conviction. "This isn't about me, or even just about William. This is about children everywhere who feel unseen. We are going to build something lasting, a foundation. And I want it to begin here in your neighborhood." Margaret studied him carefully. "A foundation is words on paper unless it has roots," she cautioned. But Richard nodded. "Then we'll give it roots," he replied. When the convoy stopped again, it wasn't at a mansion or an office tower. It was in front of the old community center Margaret had taken Emily to on rainy afternoons. The building was tired, its walls cracked, its windows fogged with years of neglect. Yet Richard stepped out as though he were arriving at a palace. He pointed to the center and said to the gathering crowd, "This will be the first of many, a place for children to be safe, to be heard, to belong." The announcement sent ripples through the crowd. Some clapped, others exchanged doubtful glances. Yet Emily's face lit up because she could already picture it, rooms filled with books, children laughing, William running without fear. She tugged at Richard's sleeve and whispered, "Can we have a room where nobody yells louder than anyone else?" Richard bent down to her height, smiling. "Yes, Emily. We'll call it the listening room. Over the next day, sketches appeared on Richard's desk, designs for reading corners, art rooms, sensory gardens where children could feel safe. He insisted that Emily have a say, and she filled his papers with drawings of swings, beanbags, and shelves stacked with crayons. William sat beside her, quiet but smiling, tracing her lines with his own pencil. For the first time in months, he wasn't merely surviving, he was imagining. But not everyone celebrated. In the local paper, a sharp headline appeared, "Billionaire buys redemption." The article questioned Richard's motives, suggesting it was a publicity stunt, a way to repair a tarnished image. One critic businessman, Stephen Cole, accused him of using charity to mask exploitation. The whispers grew, and with them came doubt. Still, the vision had already taken root. Families who had once felt abandoned gathered at the old community center, curious to see what would come. Children pressed their faces to the dusty windows, imagining the playgrounds promised inside. And every evening, the sound of engines returning to Margaret Street reminded the neighborhood that something extraordinary was underway. The supercars may have stolen the headlines, but what lingered in people's hearts was not the display of wealth. It was the sight of two children hand in hand, proving that kindness had the power to move mountains and apparently convoys of luxury cars. When the first doors of the new center swung open, it felt like more than a ribbon cutting. For the children who wandered inside, it was the start of something they had never experienced before, a place where they belonged. The once abandoned community building in Boston had been transformed with paint that smelled fresh, walls covered in bright murals, and shelves overflowing with books chosen with Emily's help. In one corner, the listening room stood exactly as she had described it, soft chairs arranged in a circle, no single seat higher than another. On the wall, in careful letters, the words read, "Everyone matters. Everyone is heard." For a while, it seemed unstoppable. William found comfort in the space, sitting cross-legged with Mr. Floppy in his lap as Emily read aloud. Families gathered, neighbors volunteered, and Margaret often stood by the door, greeting parents with the same warmth she had always carried. Richard came frequently dressed not in tailored suits, but in simple sweaters, sitting quietly in circles, with children who had never known a man of his stature would listen to them. It was more than a project, it was becoming a heartbeat for the neighborhood. Then came the first blow. Stephen Cole, the businessman who had already cast suspicion on Richard's motives, filed an injunction. He claimed the center had violated zoning rules, that its funding lacked transparency, and that it set a dangerous precedent of private wealth overshadowing public responsibility. His words struck a chord with some in the community who were wary of billionaires and promises that seemed too good to be true. Within weeks, the center was forced to close its doors. On the day the chains were fastened to the front gate, children stood crying in the street, pressing their faces against the iron bars. Emily was among them, clutching William's hand, her brows furrowed in disbelief. She couldn't understand how a place that had given so much hope could be taken away with nothing more than papers and signatures. Margaret knelt beside her granddaughter, her voice steady, but her eyes heavy. Sometimes kindness meets walls, Emily. But walls can be rebuilt. The loss cut deep. The headlines shifted overnight from praise to doubt. Reporters who once celebrated the Whitmore Foundation now questioned whether it was doomed from the start. Richard's shoulders carried the weight of public scrutiny, but in the quiet moments he only thought of the children who had no safe place to go. Margaret's words, however, sparked something. Within days, the community began to improvise. A local church opened its basement, setting up folding chairs and plastic bins filled with donated toys. A cafe owner cleared space in the back room where high school volunteers helped children with homework after hours. A barber offered his shop on Sundays, lining up kids in chairs to tell their stories while waiting for haircuts. What had begun as one building was becoming many, scattered but alive. Emily and William went to every one of them carrying Mr. Floppy like a small mascot of resilience. Richard watched it unfold humbled. He realized then that this movement wasn't about his wealth or his name, it was about people staying. People refusing to give up even when the doors were locked. That realization brought an anonymous letter one morning. Folded neatly inside a plain envelope, it contained a deed to a piece of land on the outskirts of Verona, donated by someone who believed in the mission but wanted no recognition. There were no strings attached, no conditions, just an opportunity. Construction began almost immediately. This time, there were no contractors arriving in polished trucks, no glossy brochures. Instead, neighbors carried lumber-hammered nails and painted walls themselves. Families brought meals for volunteers. Teenagers carried bricks, and retirees taught children how to plant flowers in the new garden. Even skeptics who had once doubted Richard found themselves picking up brushes and tools. It was no longer a billionaire's project, it was theirs. Emily worked alongside them, her hands covered in paint, her laughter echoing across the site. William, shy but eager, planted the first tree by the entrance, placing Mr. Floppy at its base for good luck. Margaret stood back, tears in her eyes, watching as strangers became a family bound by purpose. Richard, standing beside her, whispered, "This is what I should have done from the beginning. Not building for them, but with them." When the final wall was raised, a storm rolled in from the horizon. For a terrifying moment, wind howled through the open frames, threatening to undo the work. But no one left. They braced themselves, holding beams, steady covering children with tarps, singing to drown out the thunder. And when the storm passed, the structure still stood battered but strong. That night, as lanterns glowed through unfinished windows, it was no longer just a building. It was a home forged by many hands. A great bronze bell was hoisted into place at the entrance. When it rang for the first time, its sound carried across the hills of Verona, deep and resonant like a promise kept. Margaret explained its meaning to Emily and William. Every time this bell rings, it reminds us that kindness doesn't end when doors close. It begins again louder than before. Children filled the rooms once more. In the listening circle, voices overlapped with laughter and tears. In the art room, drawings of storms and rainbows covered the walls. In the garden, parents rested on benches, watching their kids run free. It wasn't flawless, and it wasn't easy, but it was alive. For Emily, it became a second home. For William, it was a place where silence no longer trapped him. And for the community, it was proof that even when powerful forces tried to shut something down, a group of ordinary people could raise it back up, stronger and steadier. The home they built was more than walls and rooms, it was a declaration. A new beginning born from struggle, loss, and resilience. A place where no child would stand hungry outside a bakery window ever again without someone noticing, without someone staying. And in the ringing of that bell, they all heard the same truth: kindness once started could never be silenced. The bell at the Verona campus had become more than just bronze and metal. Every time it rang, it carried the sound of a promise kept, of stories that might have ended in silence, but instead found their way to hope. Families gathered in its shadow. Children raced to be the one to tug the rope, and the sound rolled across the town like a heartbeat. To Emily, it meant home. To William, it meant safety. To Richard, it meant redemption. What began as a single act of kindness was now shaping lives in ways no one had expected. The center had grown into a place where walls told stories. In one hallway, drawings lined the plaster, each one capturing a child's idea of belonging a family at a picnic. A house with a door always open, a circle where no one sat higher than anyone else. In the listening room, voices of children who once had nothing to say now filled the air, their stories pouring out like water breaking through a dam. Margaret often sat quietly in the corner listening. She knew these were the moments that gave the project its soul. But what gave it power was not just the children. It was those who chose to stay, even when it was hard. Stephen Cole, once the loudest critic, appeared one morning carrying boxes of supplies. People stared, but he didn't make a speech. He simply rolled up his sleeves and began helping repair a fence that had been damaged in the storm. Later, when someone asked why he shrugged, "I was wrong," he admitted. "You can fight money, but you can't fight what's real. And this is real." There was also James, a teenager who had once caused trouble in the neighborhood, restless and angry. After the storm that nearly tore down the walls, he vanished, ashamed of mistakes he had made. Weeks later, he returned, standing at the edge of the listening circle with his head lowered. Margaret invited him in without a word. He confessed haltingly about the fights he had started, the things he had broken, the trust he had betrayed. Emily looked at him with the same steady gaze she had once given William in the bakery. "It's okay to be sorry," she said. "It's better to stay." That simple sentence gave James a place to begin again. He became one of the campus's most dedicated volunteers, guiding younger children who saw in him not a perfect role model, but someone who understood. The mayor of Verona eventually visited, drawn not by headlines but by the undeniable impact. Standing before a crowd of parents and children, she announced a partnership between the city and the Whitmore Foundation, ensuring that the campus would receive permanent support. Her words echoed through the courtyard. "This is not just the future. This is the present. And it is here because people stayed." Richard listened, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. He knew money had built the first walls, but it was people's belief that had kept them standing. His empire had once been about acquisitions, contracts, and numbers on a ledger. Now he understood that his true legacy was not the fortune he had accumulated, but the lives changed because one little girl had chosen to give away half a sandwich. Emily, now comfortable among the crowd, never saw herself as the heroine others claimed she was. To her, William was still just William, the boy with the toy rabbit and quiet eyes who had once looked so hungry in a bakery window. When asked by a reporter what she thought of all that had happened, she gave a simple answer. "I didn't save him. I just stayed." Her words spread, carried by headlines, shared across television screens and social media posts, but they were never meant to be profound. They were simply the truth. On the campus lawn, where the garden bloomed with wildflowers planted by children's hands, a plaque was placed beneath the bell. It read, "For every child who needs someone to stay." Visitors from across the country came to see it, bringing donations, offering to start similar programs in their own towns. The idea spread not as a grand initiative, but as a movement born of ordinary people doing something simple, showing up, and not leaving when things got hard. At sunset, the campus often glowed with the sounds of children playing, their laughter carried across the hills. Margaret sometimes sat on the porch with a cup of tea, her eyes on Emily and William racing through the grass. She thought about how fragile the beginning had been, how easily the story could have ended in that bakery with nothing more than a sandwich shared and a boy forgotten again. But it hadn't ended. It had become something much larger. The legacy was not in the supercars that had once drawn attention to their street, nor in the headlines that had made the story go viral. The legacy was in the staying in the neighbors who kept showing up, in the teenagers who admitted mistakes, in the critics who changed their minds, and in the children who found their voices within the circle. One evening, as the bronze bell rang out across Verona, William stood beside Emily, his voice no longer silent, but clear. "We're going to keep this place alive," he told her. She smiled, squeezing his hand. "We already have," she replied. And so the story of a sandwich became the story of a city, a movement, a truth carried forward, that kindness, when it stays, becomes stronger than money, louder than criticism, and more lasting than stone. It becomes a legacy, and every time the bell rings, that legacy continues. The story we have followed is not about wealth headlines, or even the roar of supercars lining a quiet neighborhood street. At its core, it is about a little girl named Emily who chose to see someone others ignored. In a small bakery in Florence, she noticed William, hungry, silent, and alone, and without hesitation she shared what she had. That choice, so simple it could have been overlooked, changed the course of many lives. It reunited a boy with his father, softened the heart of a billionaire, inspired a community, and gave birth to something larger than anyone could have expected, a movement built not on saving but on staying. We saw William go from silence to speech, from fear to belonging, because one child treated him as a friend rather than a stranger. We saw Richard, a man who once measured success in numbers, discover that the greatest wealth is found in compassion and connection. We watched as an abandoned community center became a campus filled with laughter, where the sound of children reading, painting, and playing replaced the emptiness of broken walls. Along the way, we saw skeptics change course. Stephen Cole, laying down his criticism to lend his hands, James, stepping out of shame to become a guide for others. These transformations remind us that redemption is not a fantasy. It is possible when people choose to stay present and rebuild trust. The bell at the Verona campus became the symbol of this truth. Its chime was more than a signal to gather. It was a reminder that kindness can endure storms, criticism, and closed doors. Every ring said to the children, to the parents, and to the city itself, "You are not forgotten. You matter. We will stay." What can we learn from this story? That sometimes the most powerful change begins not with grand gestures but with something small. A sandwich, a hand offered, a listening ear. Too often, we believe our contributions are too insignificant to matter. We wait for someone richer, louder, or more powerful to step in, but this story proves otherwise. Emily didn't wait. She didn't calculate the cost or wonder about the outcome. She simply acted with kindness, and that choice grew into a legacy. In our own lives, we can practice the same. You don't need to build a foundation to make a difference. You can start in your own home, your workplace, your community. Stay with someone who feels invisible. Show up for a friend going through hardship. Volunteer your time, even in small amounts. Be the person who doesn't walk away when things get messy. These actions may not make headlines, but they can change lives in ways you may never fully see. The lesson is this: saving can be temporary, but staying creates transformation. Staying requires commitment. It demands patience. It asks us to lean into discomfort and remain present even when results don't come quickly. But when we stay, we give others the courage to heal, to grow, and to believe in themselves again. That is the legacy of Emily's kindness. That is the legacy of staying. So, as you reflect on this story, I want you to think about the places in your own life where you can stay. Who around you might need someone to listen, to notice, to care? What simple act could you offer today that might ripple far beyond what you can imagine? It doesn't take wealth, influence, or fame. It only takes the courage to begin. If this story has touched your heart, if it reminded you of what really matters, then I invite you to continue this journey with us. Subscribe to this channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this story with someone who needs encouragement. Your support gives us the strength to keep creating meaningful content, to tell stories that inspire, and to remind us all that even in a noisy world, kindness still speaks the loudest. Because kindness is not the end of a story, it is the beginning of many more. And together, by staying, we can write the next chapter.